Daf Kuf Beis Amud Aleph, the Mishnah towards the top. Continue with the discussion about doors and bolts and what is permitted on Shabbos. Zok the Mishnah, Nagar HaNigra, if you have a bolt of a door that drags on the ground, it's tied, and we'll see in the Gemara the particulars and how it's tied, but it has a long cord so that one end of it is on the ground, it's resting on the ground. So the bolt is tied with a long cord, and the bolt reaches the ground. No one boy b'mikdash. In the base of mikdash, we're not going. So we have a general rule: ein shvuos b'mikdash. As we'll see more weiter that there are exceptions to this, but we have a general rule: ein shvuos b'mikdash. So therefore, there's no deraisa over here. There's no malacha deraisa being boin over here. It is not something that you're constructing in a permanent way into the wall, into the opening. It would be also midrabanan, because since the bolt rests on the ground, it would be also midrabanan. But in the base of mikdash, we're not goyzer ein shvuos b'mikdash. Avaloi b'medina, but outside the base of mikdash, it's also there's the isur d'rabanan l'gzeira. It's mechzek boina. It looks like you're being boina. V'hamunach, but if it's resting on the ground, meaning it's not attached, so you have a bolt that's just sitting on the ground, so you're picking it up and inserting it into the hole. Over there, we say v'hamunach kan v'kan aser. In both places, it's also Tanakama holds, because this is not a d'rabanan, that this would be a deraisa d'geisur of being boina. And so therefore, it's also even the base of mikdash. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, however, Rabbi Yehuda says, Hamunach mutar b'mikdash. He says even the munach is mutar the mikdash, because even the munach is not an isur deraisa. Even the munach is not an isur deraisa. It was made for the purpose of being a bolt for the door, and it's not construction material, and therefore, even if it's not attached at all, it's not a deraisa. Therefore, in a base of mikdash, it would be mutar. It's a derabanan, and therefore, it's munach is mutar b'mikdash, and it's mutar mivanigrar b'medina. And the one which drags, which is tied, but it rests on the ground, is mutar even medina. Meaning, Rabbi Yehuda says the munach b'mikdash is mutar, but a munach would be an isur d'rabanan. So in Medina, it's also a nigrar, which if it's tied but it's resting on the ground, there it's also even the Medina. Rather, it would also in such a case. So the Gemara Tan Rabbanon Ezehu Nagar HaNigrar. When we say Nagar and Nigar, what are we talking about here? What's the case over here? Should we say that in the base of Mikdash is mutar, but not outside the base of Mikdash? It's kol shekol shevatoloi. It's tied and it's suspended. And one end of it reaches the ground. The other end, it's not on the ground, but on one end it is on the ground. That's the case where we say no b'Mikdash. Avaloi b'Medina. Taisus in Shabbos says that in the mikdash will be mutar even if both ends are on the ground. It still would be mutar because it's still only an isur d'rabanan and ain't shvuos b'mikdash. But what we mean to say over here is that even if only one end of it is lying on the ground and the other end is not, even in such a case, it is also in the Medina. So that's the case over here. Rabbi Yehuda, he says, Medina mutar, he says if it's tied, even if it's one end that's on the ground, even Medina would be mutar. This would be in the Medina, also it would be mutar. What is the case we're talking about? It's not tied at all. It's not tied, it's not suspended. It's resting in a corner. That's the case that we say that in the Mikdash it's mutar, and in the Medina it's also. Because Rabbi Yehuda holds that even in such a case there's no isur deraisa. Omar Rabbi Yehuda, Omar Shmuel, halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda ben Nigrar. Said the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda and a bolt that drags on the ground. Meaning that even if it drags on the ground, it's still mutar. It's still mutar in the Medina. Not the halachas like Rabbi Yehuda ben Nagar and Nigrar. So the dik, the medaik, the rishonim, the halachas like Rabbi Yehuda ben Nigrar. The halachas like Rabbi Yehuda when it's Nigrar. When it's Nigrar, that's where the halachas like Rabbi Yehuda. But in the munach, when it's not attached at all, there we don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. We paskin like the Tanakama. So He said that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Nigar, that if it's attached to the door, even if it's on the ground, it's mutter. There's a machlekes rishonim. Doesn't mean if it's totally on the ground or even partially on the ground. So the Taisus in Shabbos says that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, that whether it doesn't make a difference whether it's totally or partially on the ground, but the Meiri is machalik between whether it's completely on the ground or only partially. Now it's important to note over here that this whole machlekes that we're discussing over here is talking where the bolt doesn't have a glustra, it doesn't have a knob on it. Previously we discussed, in the previous mission we discussed whether it has a glustra. Over here what we're discussing is whether there is no glustra. If it has a glustra, then if it's tied, even if it's drags, it still would be mutter. So if it's tied to the door, even if it drags, if it has a glustra, it would be mutter. The bolt that we're discussing over here is where there's no glustra. So the halach, he said, the halach is Rabbi Yehuda ben Nigar. Omar Rava v'husha kosher bedelas. He said that is only when it is kosher bedelas, when it's tied to the door, not only to the doorway, but it's tied to the door. If it's tied to the door, then it has an appearance as being part of the door, and you're not building. But if it's tied, even if it's tied, but if it's tied to the doorway, it does not have the appearance of being part of the door, and therefore it looks like you're being boina. And he saw that there was a bolt that was told it was tied from the bar of the door, not from the door itself, but from the bar of the door. The doors have, besides the bolt that it has a horizontal section over here. So it wasn't tied to the door, it was tied to that part of it. So he saw that it was tied and he did not object to it. So you see apparently that it's mutter. The Gemara says that was mutter because over there it was so secure that if you picked up the cord that it was tied to, it would be able to pick up the bolt. If it's tied in such a secure way, then it would be mutter. But we're talking where it's not tied in such a secure way, and therefore there it has to be tied dafka to the door, but not to the horizontal section. Ravavi went to the city of Naharda, Chazil Gavra, Davakata Begemi. He saw a person who tied the bolt with a reed, with a reed, which is flimsy. Omar Dain Loy Nitrik. He said that it can't be secured. That when you tie it with a gemi, it breaks easily, so it can't be secured this way. So therefore, it's not considered tied. And therefore, it's also to use it, and even if it's tied, even to the door itself, in such a case, the Ritva speaks out, even if it's tied to the door itself, it's not considered tied. It just breaks off. If the bolt comes and is now not only is inserted into the threshold, but it's inserted all the way down and it rests on the ground. So what's the din in such a case? Nikmas Mao. Amma Rav Yosef said, Mighty boy, what's your shaila? Loishmila, Hadasanya, didn't you hear what we learned in the Bryce and Nishmat? That if the bolt is now, it was torn away, the cord that was tied to the bolt tore. So the cord snapped, it's also. But Nikmas, if it's Nikmas, it's pushed out into the ground, it's mutter. But Rav Yehuda Omar, he said, Nikma is alpha pishena nishmat also. He said, no, it's also. Va'om Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel, halacha Rav Yehuda ben Nikmas, and that's the halacha by Nikmas. And the time of my, what is the reason for that? Because since it's inserted all the way into the ground and it's resting on the ground, it looks like you're building. It has more of an appearance of baina, and it is also. For the bolt, he made a handle for the bolt, so now it has a handle on it. What's the din? Abaye said, you're telling you made a pestle, you had a handle, so now it's like a kli. It's a kli, and therefore it's not mechzik baina because you're using a kli. Itmar Amar of Nachum Barada also Beis Yad Muter. He made a Beis Yad, it's Muter. How Sharisa the Havabe Rabbedas. There was a beam that was in the home of Rabbedas to have a middle bay. Asora was so heavy that it took 10 people to lift it. Shodale Adasha, they put it against the door so that it should hold the door, that people shouldn't be able to open the door. So they did it to secure the door. And he didn't object to that. Omar Taras Kliala. It has a term of a kli, so you're using a kli, and it's not mechzik. How Asisa Dahavi Amar Shmuel, there was a mortar in the home of Mar Shmuel, so the mortar, you take a pestle and you grind in a mortar. So this is the kli that you use, the Asisa. Dahamachsach adriva, and it was so big that it could hold a lesach. It is a half a kur, so it's huge, it's 15 saw. He permitted them to use it to secure the door, to press against the door to secure it. And also similarly has a din of a kli. He sent them the following: please tell us from the good dvorim, from the good memories that you mentioned by the arches of a boat. They had ships that they used to have arches. They used to have arches on top, and they would cover it with mats. When they wanted it to be a covered boat, they would cover it with mats, and they wanted it to be open. In the open air, they removed the mats. So they had these arches. So he said as follows. He said, the arches of the boat, if the arches are a tefach thick, so then they already have a din of an oil. Or alternatively, even if they're not a tefach thick, so the arch itself on its own, each individual arch is not an oil, but there's no three between them, then we would say lovwood, so it's considered to be joined. So it's considered to be like you have a roof. So you already have an oil. Then lamachar maybe machzel separasaleim. The following day on Shabbos you can bring a mat and stretch it and spread it over it. Why is it mutter? My time, because he's adding to an existing oil, and he's adding on it oil arai. It's only a temporary oil, and he's not making it from scratch. He's only adding to it, and therefore it's mutter. Hano and Dichri Dahavale Rapuna, he had rams. In the daytime, they needed a covering to give them shade. But at nighttime, they needed it to be open so they can have avir. Also, the Ravi came in front of Rav Amr. He said to him, Zil Korach Buja, roll up a mat, the shire by tefach, and leave a tefach of it that's already spread out. So roll it up, but don't remove it. So you had a covering, a frame, and leave at least a tefach of it that's still there. So you have an existing oil. Now, for the next day, you can roll it out because you're just meisiv on an oil aray. So l'machar pashta, on Shabbos you can unroll it, and it's mutter, because meisiv al oil aray hu v'shapat dami, because you're only being meisiv on an oil aray, and therefore it's mutter.